Hello and welcome to this video presentation about sustainability reporting. This presentation is divided up into several different parts. When you look at the PowerPoint slides with a blue background, this provides a background to the present day EU directive on sustainability reporting, corporate sustainability reporting, because there was something before that called the NFRD. And then we move on to the CSRD, the EU Corporate Social Responsibility Directive. We're going to take a brief tour of some companies, a tour so to speak, in the city of Lund, Sweden, where I live. Which one of these are required to have a CSRD compliant sustainability report and why? Then I'll talk more about CSRD, and if you're outside of the EU, what might there be instead of the CSRD? That is the GRI, and that appears with a green background. The middle part has a white background. So the idea behind that is to try to help you orient yourself. You'll see the slides here, and from time to time, some of the slides I might display as I'm talking. So, if we go back a few years in time, Sweden was a relatively new member of the EU, and as at least my Swedish program students in environmental studies know, that when you have an EU directive, that's something which each member state has to follow. It has to be incorporated into local decisions. The gist of it has to be incorporated into that. And in Sweden it was decided that in 2016 that the NFRD would become part of what is called Årsredovisningslagen, the yearly reports law. That's the financial reports that all kinds of organizations have to make. And at the time, if a company was covered by certain criteria that the NFRD had, then a sustainability report was required. And that needed to be a part of the yearly statement, the Årsredovisning, as it's called in Swedish. Alternatively, a separate sustainability report could be made. At the time, you had to have at least 250 employees or more, and a certain level of turnover. If it's a separate report, it had to be submitted to an external review by accountants in the same time frame as the yearly financial report. And all member states had to incorporate the NFRD, and the CSRD replaces the NFRD, as we'll see. What had to be included in the sustainability report for the NFRD? And companies that were included in the NFRD requirement and had written sustainability reports, they are better prepared to start to write the CSRD compliant sustainability reports. We needed to find information in the sustainability report of that kind to understand the development of the company, its impacts on the environment, its impact on social conditions, its impact on employees, and respect for human rights, and an understanding of how the company attempts to avoid corruption, and the consequences of all its impacts. And the information would include talking about the business model, policy that the company uses in the area in question, a review of the activities and the result of these policies, and risks that have to do with those particular topics or these questions, and those risks that are linked to the activities of the company, which can even include relevant business relations with other organizations, products and services that in all likelihood are going to give rise to negative consequences, and also how the company manages these risks. And then there needed to be how the company manages these risks, and then there needed to be central performance indicators that are relevant for the company activities, because in the financial yearly statement that's made, performance indicators that accountants in an investing company might be looking at, saying, well, is it worthwhile investing in that company or not? So you need to have non-financial performance indicators linked to these topic areas here. And if there are no policy or routines in one of these areas in question, then in the sustainability report the company is going to have a very good explanation why there's no such policy or such routines in that area. And the company could argue that because of its business model and its activities and its business relations, there are certain things that it has nothing to do with. At least that's an argument that could have been made in the past, in the time in the NFRD. So then we have the CSRD replaced the NFRD on the 5th of January 2025, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And starting with sustainability reports issued in 2024, the CSRD will be the requirement. And this means that this course, the MV 241E in the Environmental Studies program at Malmö University, switches to the CSRD. There could have been organizations that have a phase-in period, and we will see that when we get more to the CSRD, that some smaller organizations could have a phase-in period. So it's first in a few years that all organizations that are intended to be covered by the CSRD will actually be covered. If a very small organization, say you only have 50 employees, this is quite a tall order of information that is required, and it would take some time to set up a system for that. On the other hand, if you do have an environmental management system, for example, that is certified according to ISO 14008 or registered according to the EMAS, the EU regulation, then it would be relatively easy in the area of the environment to sort of start doing this, because you already have a lot of this information already if you have a good environmental management system. So we see already by mentioning this, for students in the Environmental Studies program, there are linkages between courses that you have in the 4th term of your program. MV 241E and then MV 244E and MV 243E all have linkages. And many students feel that the course that's in between, the Swedish Environmental Law course, has linkages to these courses as well. So the differences are there are more companies included because of the CSRD, even though there's this phase-in period for the smaller companies. Another thing which is sort of like a loophole, what about companies that are not EU companies, but they have daughter companies or subsidiary companies in the EU? Well, these companies are going to be covered by the directive, at least their daughter companies have to be. If the parent non-EU company wants to decide that the daughter company's sustainability report should be sort of a part of the entire group, well, that's also possible. In the past, insurance, banking, and similar companies were not clearly included in the NFRD, and that's another one of the loopholes that the CSRD attempted to make sure that all kinds of, as they call them in the CSRD, undertakings, even if they're credit institutions, should be included. Another difference is that sustainability and supply chain is included, and also that the company needs to explain how sustainability is included in key decisions and decision-making process in the company. So in the past, with the NFRD, there were about 11,000 to 12,000 companies within the EU that had to comply, but the estimate is that in the future with the CSRD that around 49,000 to 50,000 companies will be covered. Of course, there's this phase-in period for the smallest companies to be able to do this. So this is quite a change that takes place going from the NFRD to the CSRD. I'm not going to say anything more about the NFRD. I just thought that for students in the course, you might need to be familiar with this, and there could be people in other places that are hearing this that might find this of interest. The CSRD didn't just come out of nowhere. There was the NFRD before that. A question we can ask ourselves, is the EU a driving global force in sustainability reporting? And we can say maybe. However, even before the NFRD, there were some companies writing and issuing sustainability reports, and some of these were outside of the EU. So what came before the NFRD and what is still valid and working outside the EU? And we can see that's in green text, and that's the GRI, which I will get to at the very end of this presentation. Something outside of the EU, but maybe not with as much strength and punch as an EU decision behind it. So we're going to go to the CSRD now, the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. I made this in yellow here to remind myself I have to say this. It says EU Albertina. Some EU documents on the internet and some when they are rendered into PDF The font is what is called EU Albertina, which seems to be the font that the EU uses. And in some of the slides you will see here that the EU Albertina is used, and the reason for that, you'll see that's taken directly from the document, copy-pasted from the document. In that case, you can see the distinction between that I've used another font. I hope I've done this consistently when I'm writing something as versus a sort of a direct copy-paste from an EU document. You should be able to tell the difference because this font here, Garmont, is a serif. It has tails on it, so to speak, whereas the EU font is sans serif. No sort of swirly kind of things on extra. That, I hope, will be clear there. We'll see as we continue to go on here. We can see the full name of the directive, and it's amending other kinds of directions and other decisions. And as I said before, the first companies that will have to apply for the new rules the first time for the 2024 financial year, and they will be reports published in 2025. And for many companies that have a financial year which goes from the 1st of January to the last of December for 2024, this means that these reports will be published during the first months of 2025. In a country like Sweden, one would expect to have these reports coming out in January, February, perhaps March. That will be the case in a number of other countries as well. Not all companies have a yearly financial year that is the same as a calendar year. You could have, for a variety of reasons, that there is a broken financial year, that the year begins in the middle of the calendar year, that you could have a short year, you have a long year for whatever reasons. It could be because a company is buying a very large company that's really affecting their activities, and they want to sort of divide that up in that period of time. So it's clearer to everyone who's reading the report, okay, now this company has bought this other company. That's changing the financial situation and the sustainability situation quite a lot. So there are a variety of reasons why companies might want to have some sort of breaking in that. In Swedish, for the Swedish students, this is usually called a bruten räkenskapsår, or redovisning. There's some context, and in the slide after this I'm going to have the EU Albertina, and we'll just skip over that quickly, but I will have that as so in the coming slide after this summary here I will have the EU Albertina, and you can read it quickly. So the CSRD talks about how that this should be seen as part of the EU Green Deal. It's not just the EU making decisions that are affecting agriculture, for example, and perhaps energy. It's also that the financial markets and investing and so forth and stock markets should be influenced by the Green Deal, and this is part of this package. And they talk about all kinds of other decisions. The Council of Ministers had a position paper on the deepening of an EU capital markets. The EU Parliament called in the past for a further development of the NFRD, and that's what the CSRD is. The European Commission in this directive refers to the UN General Assembly and Sustainable Development Goals. So they're putting everything in an EU context, but they're also putting everything in a global United Nations context. They also point out that stakeholders, including investors that are investing money in shares in various companies, but also we could imagine banks that are issuing loans and so forth. There's a rising demand for more reliable information of the kind that might be found in a sustainability report. It's not enough with just financial information. And so the Commission justifies the CSRD, besides all of the things, is there's a need to fill what they call a policy gap. So here we go. I'll just let this up for a moment. It was all the points I talked about before. You can look at it quickly. For the Swedish Environmental Studies students, this will be available in a PowerPoint slide besides this lecture. Another kind of context besides the why, they were talking about a policy gap. Of course, with the idea of subsidiarity and proportionality, which are some of the principles in the EU. They need to justify how could the CSRD be useful. They already said there was a policy gap, but how could this be used? There could be a number of stakeholders which are not investors. They will be able to get more and better and more reliable information to be able to engage in a social dialogue in society, as they say. In other words, other kinds of organizations will be able to talk about sustainability in conjunction with the companies that are covered by the CSRD. But looking at investors, and particularly in their interest in the area of climate issues, but increasingly other environmental and social issues have a growing demand. They have growing demand for information to guide investment decisions. And this, they say, is increasingly important in the context of the EU Green Deal. Everything links back to the Green Deal. If you're not in the EU, or in some countries in the EU, you probably wonder, well, what's the EU Green Deal? But that's beyond the scope of this lecture. And the Commission emphasizes that the companies themselves actually need the CSRD. That's a different kind of twist on it. Because they will be able to become better and more involved with existing and new stakeholders. How about that? Without the CSRD, this will be an obstacle to progress in these areas. Yes, there are voluntary guidelines, but there must be a mandatory standard to become part of how businesses work in their everyday practice. At some point, the idea is that the CSRD will become normal for all these companies to do. It won't be anything sort of special. And they also say if the EU does not act, there's a risk that individual member states will start to create their own equivalent decisions, and that will cause difficulties for companies that are working within the whole EU. They'll have to have something like the CSRD, say, in France, and something like the CSRD in Italy, and something like that in Poland, and something like that in Germany, and so forth. It'll just be a mess for those kinds of companies and create additional work and problems for them. It would also mean that it will be difficult to compare, say, a daughter company of some sort of group in one company or another that was covered by something CSRD-like, but it was national decisions. So which organizations are covered by the CSRD? Let's look a little closer here. If your company has more than 500 employees, and regardless if there are shares that are owned by shareholders, then you're included. Because if you have if your company is maybe owned by a family and has more than 500 employees, they're going to be a large actor as part of various value chains. It's not so much of interest to investors then. That was one of the points that was before. It's more of interest to non-financial, non-investor stakeholders. Then we have the matter of corporate groups. If you have one company that owns a variety of other companies, and certain decisions are made at the corporate group company, the holding company, so to speak, and others are made in the individual companies. And here we have an example, Volkswagen AG. And if you look more closely at the slide, you can see that the Volkswagen AG is the corporate group, and that they have various kinds of vehicle brands. I didn't list them all, and you can see the source where I found that, and in a number of cases, each brand is a separate company. So who's going to make the sustainability report? Is there going to be a Volkswagen AG report for all of them? Or is each individual company going to have a sustainability report? And how are we going to solve that? We'll get to that in a moment. Small and medium enterprises whose shares are traded within the EU, that's fewer than 500 employees, should have the option to voluntarily report according to CSRD. And at first one would say to oneself perhaps, well, why would they want to voluntarily do that? Well, what happens if they want to attract an investor and they don't have a sustainability report according to the CSRD, and there are other companies of similar kind that have a sustainability report according to the CSRD? Well, the investor might say, we don't dare work with that small SME there because they don't have a report like that, but these have reports. So that means that it could be a market-driven expansion of the CSRD to increasingly smaller companies. This is a way for the EU to provide some sort of flexibility here. If investors are interested in this kind of thing, they will force more and more smaller companies to have a sustainability report which complies with the CSRD, even if the CSRD doesn't require it of them. And then there are so-called third country undertakings, and undertakings is the word that the EU Commission uses in the document to talk about companies, and they do that, try to have some sort of a neutral terminology for all kinds of business organizations. What about the third country undertakings? That is to say, companies that are not EU companies, but they have activities in EU markets. And there's a requirement here: if these companies generate a net turnover of more than 150 million euros in the Union, and subsidiaries of non-EU companies with a threshold of having a net turnover of more than 40 million euros. So it's not a question of employees in this case. Here I am outside the offices and one of the production complexes of Tetra Pak, and it's a wintry day in January 2025. Should Tetra Pak be issuing a CSRD compliant sustainability report during the start of 2025? Yes, since Tetra Pak, as of 2019, the latest numbers that I had more than 25,000 employees. Of course, there are not 25,000 employees on this site. It's just one of two headquarters for the company. And as we can see on the Tetra Pak website during January 2025, there's a tab about sustainability. On the other hand, Tetra Pak is part of the Tetra Laval group. So considering the CSRD, then Tetra Pak Sustainability Report might be part of the group report about sustainability. But when we look at the Tetra Laval group website, we see that there's also a tab called Sustainability here. So it looks like Tetra Laval is reporting for the group, and Tetra Pak, which is part of the group, is also reporting. At least this was the reporting before the CSRD came into force. Perhaps the reporting at the Tetra Laval level and Tetra Pak is because Alpha Laval, which is part of the group, makes, among other things, heat exchangers, and Tetra Pak is more focused on food packaging. They're very different branches, and so their environmental risks and impacts might be very different. So maybe it makes sense to have sustainability reports at the top or group level, but also within the companies that are part of the group. Next up, Lunds Energi, or Kraftringen, which is a municipally owned energy company with headquarters in Lund. It was difficult to find a building that would represent, and the office is a very nondescript building. There are 4 municipalities that together own the company, and they appoint representatives to the board. And as of late 2024, Kraftringen had about 650 employees. So this means the company, even if the shares are not traded publicly on a stock exchange, fulfills the 500 employee criteria, and we would expect in 2025 a sustainability report which fulfills the CSRD requirements. And now we come to Baxter, or more correctly perhaps Baxter International, which is an American multinational medical technology company. Baxter bought the Swedish company Gambro about 10 years ago. Gambro made, among various equipment and products, dialysis machines based on the invention and clinical trials in the 1940s started by a Niels Alvall, who was a doctor at the University Hospital in Lund. Baxter has websites dedicated to all EU countries except Luxembourg, so it might be correct to assume that Baxter has enough employees within the EU to fall within the CSRD in the third country category. The question is, will Baxter International issue a sustainability report that fulfills the CSRD requirements, or will there be sustainability reports fulfilling the CSRD in the various daughter companies and subsidiaries operating within the EU? As of today, in late January 2025, I do not know. Each third country company and group will have to decide this, how they relate to and fulfill the CSRD practically. For those of you watching and are Swedish students, Baxter closed production in Lund in 2020 and moved all production to Italy, so this place is mostly just a shell now, so to speak. I could have gone around to more locations in Lund and Malmö, bringing up examples of companies that might have to produce and issue a CSRD compliant sustainability report, but that would have made this video production longer. And generally, I have the impression that some students find some of my presentations longish, so I'll stop the tour of organizations in southwestern Sweden now. So if we think about small, medium-sized enterprises and sustainability reports, at the purple text, we can see that it's voluntary. Why would that be the case? We can imagine a situation where we have an S, and then there are companies which have sustainability reports and they're competing in the same branch. That could mean that the smaller company, the SME, could be at a disadvantage. Looking now at the green text, we see that companies which are non-EU companies, if they have in total a turnover of more than 150 million euros in EU markets, they have to have a sustainability report covered by the CSRD. The same is the case if they have a subsidiary. If they have a subsidiary with a turnover of more than 40 million euros, they have to make a CSRD compliant sustainability report. What about credit institutions and others, insurance and so forth, banks, companies that just invest money in other companies and don't have any production of goods or services themselves? Well, and how the CSRD, those who wrote that, drafted that, saw that there could be some sort of pressure put on the market by these organizations. They are used to dealing with risks that they can see in yearly financial reports. Now they want more information about other kinds of risks dealing with the environment and social conditions. Instead of having 500 employees as the cutoff point, the decision was made in the CSRD when these organizations were included, when they were sort of not really included in the NFRD in the past, that this would be based on net turnover, and they refer to other decisions taken by the EU about net turnover and so forth. I'm going to simplify things here. I'm going to make things simple, and I'm not going to make this presentation any longer, so we'll leave out banking, credit, or insurance undertakings outside of further consideration here and now. Something which then having to do with SMEs, again, the CSRD talks about, is that member states might need to help smaller undertakings or companies in making sustainability reports. Your own SMEs, and particularly what they call micro companies, very small companies that might come under pressure to issue a sustainability report that fulfills the requirements of the CSRD, it could be that maybe that you need to make sure that these organizations which will have difficulty making their first sustainability reports, maybe they need to have ways that the member states need to help these organizations. So consider introducing measures to support SMEs in applying the sustainability reporting standards. It's not a requirement, but it could be an idea. Another point has to do with the subsidiaries. The subsidiaries for example, they're owned by a non-EU headquartered company. If these subsidiary undertakings aren't writing their own sustainability reports, they need to write in their yearly report. They need to refer there to the sustainability report that's written at the group level. And then they talk about the importance of publishing in certain languages, in languages that they accept. Because if you could imagine that the parent company uses a language which few people in the country where the domestic SME is can read well, then maybe that's going to be a problem doing that. So it may be necessary to provide translation. Let's suppose we have, I'll just make this up off the top of my head. Let's suppose we have a multinational company headquartered in, say, Indonesia that has bought several companies working with similar kinds of products and services in more than one EU country. And this Indonesian company normally issues its yearly report or sustainability report in the language there. I understand that Malaysia and Indonesia in some extent share the same language, and there's some sort of controversy to what extent they're separate languages or not, and the name of the language and so forth. We'll just leave that aside for the moment there. And so if you are in France and no one can read that language, then they can't read the sustainability report. So it might make sense to provide translations at the group level into languages that are commonly used in the countries where the subsidiaries are located. So that becomes an administrative task. If you're going to have the sustainability report at the group level, then you're going to have to make sure that it is accessible and can be easily found when looking at the subsidiaries' reports. Not their sustainability reports, but their yearly financial reports, where there will be a link to that. So the CSRD, in a number of places, refers to ESRS, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. And the ESRS was established between 2023 and 2024. Maybe it was established in 2023 and then decided on in 2024. I'll simplify matters there. And where does the ESRS come from? The European Commission turned to a number of large financial sector actors within working within the EU and requested they form an advisory group. And so we have the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, which is incorporated in Belgium. And we can see that they have a website there. This was a request on the European Commission that EFRAG would provide advice in certain financial issues to the European Commission. And so the European Commission writes the CSRD and then refers to the ESRS in that. And there is a, as they call it, a delegated regulation. In other words, they have delegated to an organization to help them write the decision. And so the CSRD sort of just is this framework, and we have to have the ESRS for it to have a complete CSRD. The ESRS functions almost like an extremely important appendix to the CSRD. And so this presentation wouldn't be complete without looking at the ESRS, the various parts and parameters. It's divided up into various sorts of parts and sections, a lengthy document. We have what they call the ESRS 1, the general requirements, the ESRS 2, general disclosures, and then they have particular topics that we can see here. I'm not going to read them all because you can look at it and read it there. But we can see, and I've put a green box around this and a purple box around this, we can see that these are environmental or environmentally related matters. And down here where the purple box is more, shall we call them, social matters, that which sometimes is referred to as corporate social responsibility. The general requirements here There needs to be information about what they call material impacts, risks, and opportunities in relation to environmental, social, and governance sustainability matters. And by governance, they're talking about governance within the organization. We could call it managerial, if you'd like, instead. And then they talk about things which are called non-material. Say, a patent that the organization has. That would not be considered something which is a material aspect of sustainability. And the three categories of the ESRS are what they call cross-cutting standards. These will apply to all organizations that must write a sustainability report based on the CSRD. And then they have what they refer to as topical standards, and they have sector-specific standards. We saw that list on the previous slide there. Those are topical standards, and then there could be sector-specific standards. You work in the agricultural sector, you work in the energy sector, then there are some sector-specific standards. So every organization covered by the CSRD must do certain things in the report, but not necessarily everything. We have the cross-cutting standards. All organizations must do their CSRD based on this ESRS dealing with the cross-cutting standards. But then, depending on the specific topics, a company may discover, well, this particular topic has no relevance to what we do, so we don't report on that. But you have to write that you can't just admit it. You have to address it by saying, our activities have nothing to do with this. I mean, most organizations somehow have some sort of connection to human-induced global heating, for example, but they may be rather indirect, so it would be rather hard to avoid saying something about that. So, for example, a company might say, we have nothing to do with marine resources under the section E3, so because we don't have anything to report there. As we'll go further here, you can see that a sustainability report meeting the CSRD and EFRAG criterion is not just a list of emissions and impacts. It's actually text describing how the organization sees their impacts. But there's also the impacts of those problems, environmental problems or social problems, how that impacts on the company, and we'll get back to that in a moment. And there's a lot of jargon to understand in the CSRD and the EFRAG. If you're a student in the Malmö University Environmental Studies program and you take the MV 244E course later, you'll run across ISO 14001, an international standard for environmental management systems, and you'll see there's a lot of jargon there. And you may come across, what you see is that some of the terms being used here, the words appear in the ISO 14001 standard, but they're used in different ways. So the CSRD and the EFRAG may be referring to something using different words compared to the ISO 14001. What can we do about this? We can just learn about that jargon and terminology if we want to work as an environmental professional. One of the reasons for all this specific terminology or jargon is that they wanted to be very specific. They wanted to reduce the likelihood of interpretation, which would create a wiggle room around, and that would create the possibility of loopholes. The more specific something is described and defined, and the better the definitions are sort of linked to each other, the more the organization will be required to do something based on, well, ISO 14001 when we get to that, or in this case the CSRD and EFRAG, and it's harder for them to have wiggle room, which means it's more for people to learn who will be dealing with these kinds of matters. Some people say that governments are too bureaucratic in decisions. Well, if companies just followed the decisions to begin with and didn't spend a lot of time trying to discover loopholes in the decisions, then maybe governments wouldn't have to be so draconian in the way they write some of their decisions. So there's that as well. When it comes to what should be reported and what are referred to as minimum disclosure requirements, this is summarizing parts of the ESRS1 and ESR2. All of the topical and sector-specific requirements have the following structure. You want to know about the governance, the strategy, the impacts, risks, and opportunities, and what they refer to as metrics and targets. And by governance, they talk about the governance processes and procedures used to monitor, manage, and oversee impacts, risks, and opportunities. The word governance they're using here, from a political science perspective, is a bit odd, because governance usually has to do with political organizations. What they mean here is the management of the organization and all the decisions and routines and so forth that are there to monitor, manage, and oversee impacts, risks, and opportunities in each specific topical and sector-specific area in the CSRD and the SSRs. Strategy. How the strategy and business model interacts with the material impacts, risks, and opportunities. So again, it's not just a list, it's a description about, well, our strategy, our business model, hate to have to admit this, but negatively impacts on the biological diversity. Of course, they're not going to be saying it exactly that way. Impacts, risks, and opportunity management, the process by which the undertaken identifies impacts, risks, and opportunities and assesses their materiality and manages sustainable matters through policies and actions. I mentioned ISO 14001 before. If an organization already has an environmental management system which fulfills the requirements of ISO 14001 or fulfills the requirements in the EU decision called EMAS, which is a sort of an EU internal standard for environmental management systems, then at least when it comes to environmental issues, you've probably already done all this. Metrics and targets. The performance of an organization, including a target we've set up. Suppose that we have a target that we're going to reduce our water use by 50% to a particular year, our energy use by 15% to a particular year. Those are the kinds of things that you're going to have to write in your report, and you're going to have to report on your progress to achieve that. It's important for the reader to be able to put that individual year's report in a context. Of course, you can look at previous year's reports, but it's also a way to force an organization to put its best face forward, so to speak, but also it might kind of put some sort of pressure on organizations to have reasonable targets and report on this, and not just sort of have a target and hope that everyone will forget about that many years later. How well this is going to work is in part determined by those that read the reports and then point out to the organization, hey, you're not doing what the CSRD says. If you do this again, you're never going to be able to borrow money from us again, or we're going to increase our insurance premium for you. So that sort of financial pressure will probably force the organization to realize that, we really can't get away from this. Of course, it depends upon the relationships this organization has with the stakeholders that provide it with financial services. Or if you have a large enough group of people that go together and create some sort of an NGO or help fund an existing NGO, and that manages to get enough space in some sort of media, social media or more traditional media, that might be a way to put a lot of pressure on the organization. Here are some parts of this AFAG document, and you can see the actual name of the whole document there. The term impacts refers to positive and negative sustainability-related impacts that are connected with the undertaking's business, as identified through an impact materiality assessment. And then there's another section which talks more about that. It refers to the actual impacts and potential future impacts. The term risks and opportunities refers to the undertaking's sustainability-related financial risks and opportunities, including those deriving from dependencies on natural, human, and social resources, as identified through a financial materiality statement. I certainly do hope that in the course that this lecture is part of, when we talk about here these different kinds of resources, there's an excellent article by Valerie Lucas about environmental management practices, where she divides up the various kinds of environmental management practices based on the different kinds of resources, natural, human, and social resources, based on Hart's resource-based model of the firm. I certainly hope that that article doesn't disappear from being used in the course. So collectively, these are referred to as IROs, impacts, risks, and opportunities, and these reflect the double materiality perspective of the ESRS, which is described in another section, as they're saying there. I will get to double materiality. There's a glossary of terms, and it's also when the terms are first used in the EFRAG document, they put them in bold and italic to show where the term is being first used, to make it easier for somebody to read the document. In this way, they're doing it rather similar to what ISO 14001 standard does as well. So, double materiality, what do they mean by that? We can say that they talk about what that means on page 9. They do talk about it in other places, but if you're looking at the EFRAG document, we'll say just page 9. They talk about impact materiality. How does the company impact on society and or the planet? And then they talk about financial materiality. How does society or the planet impact on the company? The impacts are going in both directions. If the impact materiality and impact on the planet causes a negative impact, could that negative impact come back and bite, so to speak, the company and cause a financial materiality? This is what they mean by this double materiality. And in the sustainability report, it's not enough to just have a list of these impacts. You have to have impacts in the other direction, and you have to demonstrate an understanding of this so that those that are reading the report can, at a more meta level, look at how you're dealing with risks and your understanding of these impacts and risks and possibilities here. And a closely related point to double materiality here is the company and its stakeholders. How does the company know about some of this materiality if it has no dialogue with its stakeholders? So a sort of an indirect hope on the part of the writers of the CSRD is that companies will be forced to interact more with their stakeholders in the process of writing their sustainability report. And sometimes the stakeholders for a company in the light of the ESRS and the CSRD go far beyond what many people in a company would be thinking of a stakeholder, and leads to circumstances where a stakeholder has no voice of its own. There's an excellent article by Hayth and Griffiths, which is usually part of this course, that has to do with nature as a potential stakeholder, and specifically the case of climate change as a way to understand the role of stakeholders and a natural stakeholder, and how perhaps the definition of stakeholder needs to expand from the more traditional business economics, business management way of viewing things to something much broader than that. And so various experts and environmental NGOs function as a proxy voice for the natural environment, which means that these companies are going to have to engage with environmental NGOs and perhaps social NGOs when it comes to corporate social responsibility. And some of these may criticize the organization's work. Something to consider here, which I read already again, is that impacts can be both positive and negative. We could imagine that a company has a material impact on the planet, which in some circumstances is somewhat negative, but is actually, generally speaking, more positive than negative. I'm not saying that we have to go around and find the silver lining in all cases and all circumstances, but there are examples where perhaps as the result of conducting a very good and thorough environmental impact assessment, the company in a major investment, which is going to take a lot of the landscape into use, in attempt to reduce the negative impact, then they decide in the areas of the land they're not going to use that they establish something which might be almost like a nature preserve, as an attempt to, or they add in more diversity to the landscape, or they buy up more land around the area, not for their own use, but then they decide that this will be sort of become wild or so. And that could be considered a way to compensate for the negative, but it could also be a positive impact that the company is doing. And again, for those of you that are taking this course and will be taking future courses later in this term, then we can see, as I'm talking about here, that there are a variety of links between the MV241E and the MV244E and the MV243E courses, or at least there should be all those links, either talked about by teachers specifically or that you yourself can make those links, depending upon what kind of course literature is available. They don't say this exactly, but on page 10 I'm saying the undertaking is more than just the legal company, so to speak, because the undertaking or the company is part of something called the value chain. They talk about the value chain very often, and that's a very commonly used word in business economics and business administration. And I talked about the value chain briefly in my project management and sustainability lecture. So we have impacts on people or the environment over short, medium, or long terms. These impacts are connected to the undertaking's own operations, but also what they refer to as being upstream and downstream the value chain, and including all kinds of goods and services. They're using the word products and services. Personally, I tend to use the word product to refer to both goods and services, because the product is something which is offered on a market. But also through business relationships including those in the undertaking's upstream and downstream value chain, and are not limited to direct contractual relationships. In other words, we have suppliers. They are downstream, they are upstream from us. And we have a contract that we buy for X number of whatever, certain number of A and B and C from this company, and D and E and F from this company, and we buy these services G and H from this company on a yearly basis. And if we don't do that, then it's going to be difficult for us to offer our own goods on the market. And there could be parts of the value chain which are not captured directly by those direct contractual relationships. What about those companies? In their turn, they are buying things from others. They wouldn't be doing that if we weren't buying things from those companies in the contractual relationships, which means that the value chain really spreads a lot more. And the value chain in the other direction is that once we have sold to our customers, be they consumers like you and me, but they could be other companies. At some point in time, there may be environmental or social problems that arise from using those products. That's part of the value chain, or at least it should be part of the value chain. Many companies have found it relatively easy to deal with the direction of the suppliers, but they find it difficult once they've sold something. Well, then the value chain is over. Well, maybe this calls into question the business model and strategy of the company. And this sort of moves us in the direction of what is referred to as life cycle leadership, and the idea of extended producer responsibility that hopefully will be touched upon in MV243E and MV244E. I should have written both names of the courses later during the term. So this lecture is linked to other lectures that will be held in other courses, hopefully. They relate to other documents, UN documents and OECD documents about assessing negative impacts. They write, the materiality assessment of a negative impact is informed by the due diligence process defined in international instruments of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises. These kinds of documents maybe you've never heard of. For the actual negative impacts, materiality is based on the severity of the impact, while for potential negative impact it is based on the severity and the likelihood of the impact. Severity is based on the following factors: the scale, scope, and the irremediability of the character of the impact. It can't be resolved. We can't return things to its original state. And they write also, in the case of potential negative human rights impact, the severity of the impact takes precedence over its likelihood. So if we have something which is a very severe consequence, but very unlikely, then we ignore the unlikelihood, at least when it comes to human rights. And what we're talking about here, or what is being talked about here in this AFRAG document, this ESRS, we're coming quite close to the idea of risks and hazards, although they're not talking about risks and hazards in the same way. They're talking about impacts and severity and likelihood. Again, notice that they're using somewhat different words. Hopefully, risks and hazards will be dealt with more in the MV 244E course, where risk assessment should be an important part of the course. What about how long are the reporting time horizons in a sustainability report? We have economic time horizons in businesses. Many businesses tend to be short. Many companies issue quarterly earnings reports during the year, and that you can, if those of you that watch evening television news, you can hear a spate of reports that are sort of issued at periods of time, and then you can hear the economic commentator talking about this, about how the market was expecting something here, was expecting greater profitability, so therefore the share price of this organization fell based on the quarterly report. Such short-term thinking doesn't seem to be very much in sync with long-term thinking, which was required with sustainability. And a yearly report, of course, that's necessary. A financial yearly report is necessary. But we have, in addition to the short-term cycles in reporting and activities in businesses, some businesses do have long-term thinking. If you think about an energy company that's going to invest in something, they're going to making an assumption about demand for electricity now and demand for electricity 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. I mean, why build this new facility if we think in the future electricity use is actually going to fall? Then it might make more sense, instead of making this new facility, we might want to run more of our existing facilities at peak capacity during the peak demand times. So a sustainability report needs to have progress based on a base year so that change over time can be seen. And a base year could be the year the first. Some of you may have been watching this video presentation based on wanting to learn and understand concepts and so forth. There are some who will be watching this not based on that, but watching about how the presentation was made. And we see that I have now switched from making recordings where I am using my camera standing beside a screen, or using a camera and going someplace outside of my home or the university campus. So now we're doing PowerPoint cameos, and those of you watching this can compare the different parts of this video presentation, the cameos and so forth. And what we can see right away is that instead of me being able to move around and see the lecturer move around, instead I'm sort of confined to this little circular area. Yes, the cameos can be made a little bigger and they can be more made like a square, but I'm just keeping the cameo. It's almost look like that students watching this are looking through a keyhole and seeing me there. I can also point out that instead of sitting and talking, I'm standing up, and I'm trying my best to be active with my hands, at least for a while, and then I'm going to sort of calm down that part and see what it's like when I just sort of drone on talking about the lecture. Sorry, students, this was for a different kind of audience. So if you have an undertaking that is going to be having a CSRD compliant sustainability report, they need to provide information concerning the value chain, but they might not be able to gather all that right away. So the first 3 years of sustainability reporting by an organization like that, they can talk about the efforts they've made to get the information they have, and the processes that they have established to ensure that after 3 years compliance will be achieved. Now we move on to topics. We have E1, climate change, E2, pollution, E3, water and marine resources. When it comes to climate change, we see that there are subtopics of adaptation and mitigation, and that's to be expected given how, for example, the IPCC divides up work that society should do with regard to climate change into mitigation and adaptation. And we see also energy is clearly placed here. It could have been placed someplace else, for example, pollution, but it's been put in the climate change topic. When we come to pollution, we see pollution of air, water, soil, living organisms, and food sources. Then it's when we come to chemicals and presumably also radioactive substances, substances of concern and substances of very high concern. There could be other substances there, but we can think about all the substances which are covered by international agreements about phasing out or limiting of these substances. For example, there's a convention on persistent organic pollution, and there are other kinds of conventions like that. That would be something that the undertakings will need to sort of relate themselves and orient themselves to. Microplastics is listed separately because as of January 2025 and as of a few years ago, when the CSRD and the ESSRS were written by AFAG, there was no convention about microplastics because those could maybe fall into substances of concern, so it was listed separately. We see water and marine resources. Marine resources could be living resources, could also be other kinds of resources in the seabed, consumption, discharges, and the like. E4, biodiversity and ecosystems. The subtopics, direct impacts on biodiversity, impacts on the state of species, impacts on the extent and conditions of ecosystems, and then impacts and dependencies on ecosystem services. Seems to be rather inclusive when we include the subtopics as well. And then we come to many of my students' favorite term, circular economy, and they've heard me say to them before, yeah, okay, but it's more like old wine in new bottles to use the term circular economy. There are other terms that have been used, and this isn't the first time that somebody's thought about this. Moving from the E listing, we come to S1, the own workforce and the working conditions and other matters which are included here. We can see in the subtopics on the right here, freedom of association, existence of working councils, participatory rights of workers, collective bargaining. As long as Elon Musk doesn't have investors that think that he needs to have a sustainability report, then maybe there's not going to be much pressure that's going to be put on him there. But I mean, if Tesla has subsidiaries in Europe, well, there's going to have to be something along those lines here. Equal treatment and opportunities for all, employment and inclusion of persons with disabilities, and so forth and so on as subtopics. And other work-related rights dealing with child labor and so forth. Then we come to the workers in the value chain. This would suggest it's not just your own employees, but workers employed in other organizations that are linked together for you to be able to achieve your value chain. And here we have what's usually thought about as CSR, corporate social responsibility, about the communities and the neighboring areas and groups in society, the economic, social, and cultural rights of the surrounding communities or communities that are impacted by the undertaking's activities, rights of indigenous peoples as a particular topic. As for consumers and other end users, about information, personal safety, social inclusion, and so forth. This is stretching the responsibility for reporting. For some companies, they might think this is rather far. Then we have G1, which is the conduct of the business itself, the business per se. Animal welfare is placed here because otherwise where would have been put? Corruption and bribery as examples. Now, if you're an environmental studies student at Malmö University in the course, I think we can say it's fair to say that in January 2025, considering all the other things that are included in the course literature and so forth this year compared to previous years, I think we can say I've sort of run out of time to talk more about CSRD in this recorded materials. There will be in the video description below, you will find links to the CSRD and the ESRS documents. So in the past, when I ran the course, there was not a superabundance of course literature. And of course, if there's a lot of course literature, a lot of books, then they all have to be covered. My approach, my pedagogical approach, is more to have less literature but work with each individual book more and include articles and other materials, because course books can become dated, or you might want to have something that will be talked about but is not in any particular book, but there's an article about it. And that would also be a way to sort of include research or more recent research in exposing students to that. That was the end of talking about the CSRD and the ESRS. I thought that when it comes to the Cameo, we'd make a sort of a switch here and see what happens now. I know that there are some people during the pandemic, they did a lot of their recording lectures with cameos like this. They sat. Obviously, no actions with their hands, no body language. So I'm going to be talking about the GRI and ISO 2600. Or 26, yes. I'm not going to talk very much about the ISO standard. There's something called GRI, which is the Global Reporting Initiative. And about 25 years ago, the GRI was founded. And it was a network of people in companies, but also people in universities and other locations that were interested in ultimately creating guidelines concerning reporting about sustainability. And those 25 years ago, there was no sense of the possibility of creating a standard at that time. Instead, because it was thought at the time it was going to be difficult to pin down what was sustainability for companies because of the diverse nature of companies all around the world, the idea was to discuss what a sustainability report could be. And through a period of experimentation, it would be possible to sort of get some of the better examples and maybe create guidelines out of that. The ISO document is also guidelines as opposed to an ISO standard like ISO 14001 for environmental management systems. And ISO is the International Organization for Standardization, sometimes wrongly called the International Standardization Organization. It's the International Organization for Standardization. And those of you that will be participating in later courses in the fourth term in the Environmental Studies program at Malmö University, you'll learn more about ISO 14001 then. So the GRI is at present headquarters in the Netherlands, and previously it was in the United States. In 2016, there was the network, the GRI network, began to transform from guidelines towards what they hope would become some sort of a standard. For those of you in the program, you may recognize this book that was used in a previous term. We have Maureen and Orsini talk about private regimes, and the GRI is what they refer to as a private regime. The latest revisions took place in 2021, so not much has changed since 2021 to 2025. And you may be hearing this presentation in years into the future. So the GRI consists of 3 parts or levels, as it's referred to, and you'll understand that. You may also, when you hear about the GRI, start to say, well, that sort of sounds a little familiar. There is some sort of similarity to the EU directive, the CSRD. So the GRI standards consist of these 3 different parts: the universal standards, and they are listed in the GRI web pages in green, which is why I chose green, as you can see, the green background there. So all of these standards are required. Then we have sector standards and topic standards, and depending upon what company you are and what you do, what sector you are in, and what kind of impacts are occurring, those would be topics. So they have made all of these standards for sectors and topics. Let's continue onward here. The universal standards 1, 2, and 3. GRI 1 is called the foundation, GRI 2, general disclosures, GRI 3, material topics. The foundation is they lay out the principles of sustainability reporting about accuracy, balance, verifiability, and so forth. When it comes to general disclosures, the kinds of things that all sustainability reports are going to be, that the companies are going to require. What kind of profile? What kind of company is this? Where does it operate, and so forth? What is the size of the operations? What kind of context is it in? How is the organization structured? What kind of reporting procedures and policies are there with regard to a number of areas, not just the sort of locked off and for itself specifically here sustainability reporting. There could be reporting procedures and policies that are related to sustainability reporting that exist already. We come to GRI 3, the material topics. The impacts of the organization determined in dialogue with stakeholders and experts, the documentation of that process, and these impacts can change as the company evolves. The highest level in the company is expected to be overseeing this process. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing it, but they're overseeing what's occurring. And we see that there is a several stage process here. We need to identify and assess impacts on an ongoing basis. We need to understand the organization's context, and we use the sector standards to understand the context. We identify actual and potential impacts, be they social or environmental. And then the topics described in the sector standards. There has to be an engagement with relevant stakeholders and experts, and we need to assess the significance of the impacts. I keep relating this to ISO 14001. If you already have an ISO 14001 environmental management system, then you already have done that, many of this with regard to environmental activities, environmental aspects, and so forth. Then we need to determine the material topics for reporting, and the material topics were the ones that were in the sort of the purple-brown color to the right. And we need to test these with experts and information users. Information users and experts, it almost sounds like we need to put together something like a focus group and see what they think about this. We need to prioritize the most significant impacts for the reporting. And then what we have here, we look at the topics which we see in the sector standards. Have we missed something that was listed in the sector standards that perhaps we should be including? Yes. So again, there seem to be similarity, as you will see if you take MV 244E, the course. There seem to be similarities and differences when it comes to ISO 14001 here. In ISO 14001, the standard speaks about aspects and effects. The word impacts is used, but it's not used in the same way that the GRI uses it. We need to have a prioritization in ISO 14001. What are the significant aspects and which are not? This kind of prioritization is a prioritization which the GRI says that we need to do when it comes to reporting. So if you already have your environmental management system, which is certified according to ISO 14001 or registered according to the EU AMAS, you already know your prioritized environmental aspects and impacts according to these standards. So then you've already done some of the work which is required in a sustainability report which complies with GRI 1 to 3. Remember, there needs to be a dialogue with stakeholders and experts. We heard about that in the CSRD and the ESRS. Questions you're asking here. So what sectors do you operate in? The sector standards will suggest topics and impacts that you need to include. What is the significance of the impacts? Check your prioritization with experts and the material topics in your sector. Returning to the foundations again. Why do we have a sustainability report is addressed in the GRI 1. Talks about the GRI system and names a number of key concepts and requirements. It also takes up 4 reporting principles which function as a sort of a quality control. There are recommendations about how to link the sustainability report to other reports, the credibility of reporting about sustainable development.
something for all organizations to read when they're considering GRI before taking any further steps. It's almost like a preamble to the rest. The report shall provide transparency about how a given organization contributes to or aims to contribute to sustainable development. They make reference to various UN and OECD documents, just like the CSRD did. So we see that the GRI is not just something in isolation. It's linked to other international initiatives. The GRI does not say that there are sort of benchmarks or values about what is good or bad performance per se, rather just that organizations need to establish some sort of base and make a comparison of their performance versus something else. GRI standards require what is called disclosure. But if an organization cannot comply with the requirement, the reason for the omission must be stated. And you can't just say, the matter doesn't exist, and assume everything's done. On the next slide, we'll see a little bit more about this. Sorry that my cameo is covering up the slide, sort of a disadvantage of recording lectures in this way. The requirements that you see in bold in GRI are shall, whereas a recommendation is should, whereas can indicates a possibility. And this kind of defining verbs is something which we find in other places, like in ISO 14001. If you don't include something, you have to have reasons for the omission in your disclosures. And why can't you comply with it? You can't just not include this. So if something you think is not applicable, then you have to explain why it's not considered applicable. And then your stakeholders, the investors and others reading this, might disagree with you. There could be, for some reason, a legal prohibition. You are doing something in a particular country and you have a contract with the government and you are not allowed to provide certain information. There could be a confidentiality constraint. You could have agreements with other companies, and in that agreement you have agreed not to provide certain information because there could be some sort of, shall we say, a business secret, a secret way to make something and that gives that company advantage compared to others. Or the information is unavailable or incomplete. Well, if the information is incomplete, what's missing? Which information is missing? Why is it unavailable or incomplete? And describe the steps being taken for the expected items to be that are required when this will occur. This is very similar to the CSRD, but the language used here is not the same as in GRI. The GRI Universal Standards were written in 2021, but the idea was that they become effective in 2023. Note the connection in time with the EU. Also, if companies issued sustainability reports that they said were according to GRI in 2021 and 2022, they're not necessarily in compliance with the GRI because the GRI standards didn't become effective until 2023. So if you happen to be looking at a company sustainability report from outside the EU from, say, 2019 or 2022, well, we have to wonder, is it actually aligned with the GRI? A number of key concepts the GRI has. Impacts, you've heard that. Material topics, you've understood that, I believe. Due diligence, I'll get to that in a moment. And stakeholder. Stakeholder is an idea, should be nothing new here for students in MV 241E, I presume. Impact can be positive or negative, just like the CSRD said. Impacts could be on people or the environment, and particularly those who are vulnerable or something which is mentioned is important here. We could imagine a situation where there's a positive impact in one area which could lead to negative impacts in another area. For example, there could be positive impacts for the welfare of people, but there could be negative impacts on the environment, and this needs to be talked about according to the GRI. Material topics. An organization often knows some of these to include, but must have a dialogue with stakeholders, perhaps experts, to ensure that nothing is missed. Due diligence. To the degree to which a company is responsible to act. If there are direct impacts, this means that there is a greater diligence, a higher responsibility. If indirect, the responsibility is more to try to have others to act, it's understood that it's impossible to solve all negative impacts at once, so there needs to be some sort of a prioritization. Here we can see the various kinds of requirements. You apply the principles, you work with all these, you publish a contact index, you provide a statement of use, and then you notify the GRI when you're done. And as the GRI says, if you don't do all of these 9 requirements, you cannot claim, no one will accept the claim that you have prepared the report according to GRI standards. You have to do everything according to all GRI standards. Otherwise, you cannot claim that you are doing something in accordance with GRI standards. Some companies do this. They cherry pick certain things and say, we have done something according to this. Yeah, you've picked the part of it that you feel like you can do, and you've skipped the rest. So this is an effort to get away from that. In total, there are 30 different matters to have to be reported listed under the GRI2 general disclosures. Here are the 5 main types of disclosures or provisions of information: the organization and its reporting. What's included in their reports, the frequency of the reports, who to contact if there are any questions. What does the organization actually do? What goods and services are produced and sold on the market? The value chain and workers who are not formal employees. I think the latter there is to make sure that in a sustainability report that the people who drive vehicles for Uber and the people who deliver food for Foodora are considered to be employees, even if Uber and Foodora don't like those people to be considered their employees. They're not formal employees, but they are working for the organizations, of course. So this is a way to try to make sure that people that have informal employment, so to speak, are actually included in the sustainability report. Otherwise, it's not complete. The word governance appears again, and as I've mentioned before, that is a very specific meaning in political science and international relations. From a business administration, a business economics term, the more traditional term is management. How is the organization managed? The documents about it's managed. How are decisions made? Strategies, policies, and practices. It's not just to have the policies, but how do you actually make sure that the goals that you have are achieved? So it's not enough to just have a beautiful document with a long list of wonderful goals, but how are you actually going to achieve this? And how did you involve the stakeholders? And the documentation about this should also include the collective bargaining which is taking place, i.e. with unions. Material topics, GRI 3. There's a guidance that is provided in GRI 3 to help determine material topics, and they talk about the general requirements for disclosure on material topics. And parts of the GRI 3 are there to include definitions of responsibility that makes it difficult to hide from your responsibility. The organization needs to be described in its context. And the material topics are the activities and impacts that are reported. This includes what's done to reduce negative impacts and perhaps enhance positive impacts. We almost recognize some of this from the CRSD. So there could be some positive employment benefits from CSRD or GRI. So that was the foundation about CSRD and about GRI. We really can't go any further into this because of the time constraints, but also it's first when you're working in a particular company, you know exactly how you're going to work with this after you have your foundation.